The lottery ticket fluttered like a bright scrap of promise before it vanished into the alley dumpster, a small, ordinary betrayal that felt ridiculous and terrible at once. Cristian watched it spin away with the dull, stunned curiosity of someone who has just seen a photograph of his life catch fire. He had joked about winning for weeks. He had held the ticket in his wallet like a private talisman. That ticket had been a talisman for better bills, a new beginning whispered into the space where both fear and desire lived. Now it was garbage, and the sound of Michelle laughing with Henry in the kitchen was a different kind of paper tearing. Before the dumpster, before the humiliation that would hollow out him, there had been a house, not a mansion, just a two-story brick place that smelled of coffee and old shampoo, with a small yard where Cristian kept a sad tomato plant he swore he'd revive. He had worked at the distribution office for 7 years, reliable, quiet, the kind of man who kept his shirts pressed and his worries to himself. He'd been ordinary in a way that made him invisible to many, but visible to the ones who mattered, until one evening his visibility was weaponized. He still remembered the heat of that afternoon, a late summer that tasted of sweat and stale soda. The radio in the living room had been playing a song he didn't particularly like. Michelle had hummed along. Henry's truck was out front. Cristian had waved at him in the driveway. They joked about paint colors, about moving the couch. That was the superficial normality. The undercurrent, texts slipped into pillows, hands that brushed longer than polite, had been folded neat and private, invisible till the seams split. Cristian found Michelle and Henry together by accident. The bedroom door cracked a fraction, the light off, the silhouette of the mattress sinking with 2 bodies. For a second he stood with his hand on the doorknob, the world narrowing to the sound of his heartbeat. When the bedroom light snapped on and the silence broke, he had been the one to break, quietly and irrevocably. "Is this?" he asked, the words small as paper. Michelle did not explain, or rather she offered the sharp economy of people who have already chosen sides. She said, "I didn't mean for you to see this," as if that made it any softer. Henry looked away, shuffling, apology wearing thin like an old shirt. The ticket fell from his pocket at some point during that evening. He never could remember when exactly, and it turned up later among the takeout boxes, crushed under a ketchup-stained lid. He fished it out and smoothed it between fingertips that shook for reasons he would only name later as betrayal, though that was too tidy for the stuttering ache that took residence in his chest. He joked to keep from crying. "Maybe this will fix it," he said, the line a brittle thing that his voice couldn't hold. It didn't fix anything. The first fissure widened into a clean crack. Within a week, his supervisor at the distribution center told him they were letting him go because of restructuring. The unemployment manager handed him a form with a kind but distant expression that read like footnotes to a funeral. In the same week, creditors' letters arrived, formal, indifferent, their fonts tiny and judgmental. An accountant had called about irregularities that turned out to be Michelle moving funds in and out without telling him. The notices multiplied. A bank freeze, a demand for overdue mortgage payments, the house that had fit them neatly like a shared joke became an arena of calculation. "You could sign the papers," Michelle said one morning, a sentence she delivered with the finality of a clerk stamping a docket. "It's easier for both of us." Easier for whom? The question had no echo in her face. Her eyes were already lined with an expectation of what would come next, a life unencumbered, claims sorted, money transferred, the future she wanted arranged. She had practiced this economy of separation. Cristian tried bargaining. He went to Henry's workplace and waited by the metal lockers, voice thick as gravel. "Look, I don't want trouble," he told Henry, who flinched as if this were a surprising mood in him. Henry's apology slipped out thin and uncommitted. He kept using the word sorry like change. He tried bribing, once a desperate, ridiculous subterfuge in a coffee shop, when he thought cash might do what words could not. Gina, an older woman who had been in their social circle, took his check and folded it without emotion. She said things that sounded like sympathy on the surface, but mapped to market logic underneath. "You should be smarter with your assets," she told him, as if advice were a kind of blade. Humiliation compounded. Co-workers who had nodded in passing now averted their eyes. Neighbors divided into those who made sympathetic noises and those who made cutting observations about what men let fall apart. The foreclosure notice came pinned to the front door like an accusation, the paper a herald of loss in red ink. Meanwhile, Michelle hired a lawyer and moved toward a swift, surgical divorce. She was calm, methodical. The governance of the end settled in her hands. The ticket, however, became something else, an object that made possibilities flourish and then wither. Cristian kept it like a prayer folded into his wallet. He imagined what he would do if numbers aligned: a fresh start, repairs, a legal team, a refund of dignity bought with currency. But the ticket in his pocket did not guarantee anything. Papers could be disputed, claims contested. The law moved like a tide, indifferent to moral truth. One night, a call from the bank told him his account would remain frozen, pending an investigation into alleged transfers. That was the practical sentence: no card, no salary, no quick cash. Another practical sentence arrived in the form of a termination notice from his company, a standard-issue letter that said, "effective immediately." It was a bureaucratic blow, the kind that makes the household ledger audible. When the eviction notice came, it did so 3 days after a neighbor's dog had smelled him with a kind of pity that made him want to crawl into the ground. A representative from the mortgage company slid the paper under his hand. "If you vacate voluntarily, it will save you legal fees," the man said, and Cristian felt like a smaller creature than the dog. He tried to fight. He called lawyers. The first one told him bluntly he needed money up front. The second took his case and then asked for references he did not have. At the shuddering midpoint of his collapse, Cristian thought about legal revenge, countersues, exposing Michelle's movements, taking witness testimony from friends who had seen what he had seen. But each plan required funds he no longer possessed, and the act of pursuing them felt kinetic but hollow, like redecorating a rubble pile. On the morning he was to be served the papers, he took the ticket out and looked at the grainy numbers. The ink had already dulled where his thumb touched it most. A smear of grease from his pocket made the strip look like a map. He thought, briefly, about what it would mean to have his name attached to a sudden fortune. He thought of the sound of Michelle's laugh, now sharp and functional when she called to schedule meetings with her lawyer. He thought of Henry, of Gina, of everyone who had calculated around him, as if he were a negative space to be filled. Cristian did not find the ticket by accident that afternoon. He had been at the alley behind the bakery because he could not bear the house alone, and because the trash had once held, in a different life, bits of his lunch, newsprint triangles, a crust of bread. He had planned to throw away old receipts, to carry something away as a small act of control. The gust that took the ticket into the dumpster felt like a betrayal from within, the world offering him a tiny cruelty to match the larger ones. He plunged his arm into the dumpster like a man reaching for a relic. The smell of rotting fruit and oil, and the city squeezed his sinuses. His hand found paper, then plastic, then the faint cross of a ticket with a corner bent by his thumb. For a moment, his fingers closed around the paper like one closing a fist around a life raft. Then a realization. Someone else had been there first. The outline of another hand's pattern of dirt on the ticket betrayed its new owner. She came out of the long afternoon, like a figure from a different book. Sarah had elbows raw from years of sifting through other people's discards. Her hair was tied back with a threadbare band, a scarf wound around her neck despite the heat. She moved with an economy of motion that was neither slow nor hurried. She knew exactly what she needed, and she took it with steady muscles. She had been the first to reach the ticket. Her fingers had almost brushed his as he put his hand in, and when he looked up at her, there was an instant that felt like a negotiation of identities. He expected suspicion, or a sharp denial, or a claim that would need courts and counsel. He expected greed, because fear had taught him to see others' actions as mirrors of his own worst impulses. Instead, Sarah offered him nothing and gave him everything. "You can't keep that," she said without preamble, studying the numbers printed in thin ink. Cristian stared. "Why not? It's mine." "You toss it," she said. It was an observation, not an accusation. "You saw it go in." He remembered doing that, or at least he had a memory of the paper leaving him. He had felt earlier like someone who had dropped a thing without meaning to. He trailed, unsure how to describe the world that had shredded where he stood. Sarah pulled the ticket closer and held it between two clean fingers. Dirt lined her nails, and a thin scar ran along one knuckle like a seam. Her clothing was patched in places that a tailor's eye could identify as long-lived. There was a crispness to the way she unfolded her small gestures, the sort of clarity that comes from living within limits and learning the contours of available goodness. "I find a lot of things," she said. "People throw better than they throw away. I don't keep things that should be kept with someone else." There was a rule in her statement that cut through the pity like a blade. She refused to be the commodified conscience of the world. She would not take the opportunity to profit from someone else's wreckage. She had, through whatever backstory made her Sarah, a code, a refusal to let another person's downfall be the foundation of her rise. Cristian wanted to thank her and apologize at the same time. He wanted to curl into himself and sleep forever. All the rhetorical positions he had held, husband, laborer, friend, felt like costumes that had fallen apart mid-show. He looked at the ticket and then at her face. There, in the line of her jaw, something like judgment and something like mercy kept company. "Why would you—" he started. A scatter of confusion and gratitude made his voice tilt. "Why would you return this?" She shrugged. "Because I know losing things, because I know keeping them doesn't always help. Besides, I'd rather not be mixed up in somebody else's mess." Her tone had no sermon. It was practicality and a kind of weary ethics. He wanted to ask more about her, to unfold the map of how she came to live in alleys and under awnings. But there was that old reflexive shame in him, a waiting that said asking was an imposition. Instead, he offered the only thing that felt like a currency he could still spend, an apology that tasted like ash. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were thin, but they were honest. Sarah pocketed the ticket and then, with a movement that seemed to be deciding another question, handed it back. "Give it to someone you trust," she said. "If it's your ticket to be used, use it honest." Those three words lodged in him. Honest, the moral clarity of a person with no bank but a code. He had been starved for such directions. When he finally left the dumpster, smelling of rot and something cleaner like rain, he felt like someone who had been given a map with a single important route drawn in red. Word of his collapse moved faster than the speed of pity. Michelle's lawyers filed for immediate separation, adding motion after motion to make the process efficient and, in Michelle's eyes, clean. Henry kept his distance. He had his own life to secure. Gina, who had once made jokes about fiscal prudence over dinner drinks, now coached Michelle on the art of sealing a settlement. The social scaffolding he had had, friends who borrowed tools, colleagues who covered shifts, neighbors who watched his cat, tilted away as if he were no longer worth the risk. Cristian slept in his car for 1 week because the alternative was having the sight of the house folded into legal facts and the urgent business of packing served by strangers. The car smelled like old fast food and the faint tang of his own despair. He would wake at dawn and stand in the parking lot outside the distribution center, watch the vans roll out, and feel the ache of being outside the rhythm he had constructed for himself. There were nights he would hum that same radio song, as if sound could stitch up memory. Sarah, meanwhile, appeared in odd places, crouched by a community garden at dusk, sweeping up fragments of people's lives, on metal benches with a thermos, offering water to anyone who looked stranded, at the public library, where she read with a hunger that treated language itself as sustenance. She did not come as a savior. She came as an inhabitant of a parallel world, who noticed when two worlds collided. Their encounters multiplied by small increments. She gave him a bottle of water on a day when the heat made him dizzy. She lent him a sweater, a faded hoodie that smelled of someone's smoke, and refused any money when he offered. Instead, she pointed him to a man who did odd jobs at the shelter. "They need help stacking crates after 4, she said. "It's honest. It'll get you tired and out of yourself." "What do you want?" he asked once, because suspicion had become a reflex and gratitude felt dangerous. "Nothing," she said. "I don't want to be your miracle. I want you to wake up." That phrasing lodged like a splinter, painful and corrective. He did not need a miraculous swoop. He needed the pedestrian, slow, grinding work of waking up and stepping forward. That was a harder kind of mercy than he had imagined. Not an erasure of loss, but the presence, steady and human, beside it. Between Sarah's help and the small indignities he endured, calls from debt collectors with pleasant, robotic voices, an unreturned favor from a former co-worker, Cristian became a man of seams. He patched himself with schedules and small tasks. He took the odd jobs Sarah suggested, stacking crates at a non-profit grocer that served those on the edge of pay. He learned to lift in ways his muscles had forgotten. The work was humble, and it was honest. It offered him a kind of rhythm that no amount of imagined lottery windfalls had ever given, the comfort of bodies aligning with purpose. Gina kept knocking on doors he had tried to close. Her involvement had more teeth than he'd expected. She suggested financial maneuvers that sounded like sophistication, until he realized they were ways to distance himself from the reality that his marriage had been transactional. "You have to be practical," she said at one point, the phrase a kind of incantation used to whitewash the moral compromises she preferred. Henry resurfaced with small gestures, a text to say, "Are you okay?" and a handshake that lingered in the wrong place. Each of those gestures felt like salt in a wound. Cristian had to decide whether to run after the pain or to let it sit and harden into a lesson. The easy moves, public accusations, a smear campaign, threats, sat on the table when he was drunk enough to consider them. They looked shiny from the distance of desperation. But Sarah's steady insistence on honest work and the recurring image of the ticket, how she had held it for a moment and then given it back, pressed on him like a moral mirror. He began to lay out small plans. Pay rent on a friend's couch with cash from odd jobs, keep important documents in a safe deposit box, which required money he did not have, contest Michelle's claim to the lottery if he could. But law is expensive, and truth bows before capital unless personhood has someone willing to hold the line. There were nights when he almost did something foolish. One particularly raw evening, he considered going to the office where Henry worked and making a scene, exposing everything to the fluorescent light of HR forms and fact-checkers. He imagined dragging out the knife of truth in public and felt satisfaction flutter like a fly in his chest. In the end, he didn't. The thought of legal consequences and the knowledge he had no funds to pursue them narrowed his appetite for spectacle. He stayed home and paced the rooms that used to be shared, imagining a life he had no right to imagine. The first mid-story break, the kind of shift that could go toward ruin or a new kind of life, came at a small, public board meeting where Michelle intended to claim some early joint assets. Cristian had been summoned by a lawyer he couldn't afford to hire for contingency alone. An aide at the shelter, who had seen him stacking crates, had offered to sit with him in the municipal office. "You don't look like the type to give up," she said, and he realized how far from confident he felt. At the office, the clerk handed him forms with bureaucratic brutality, stamps and signatures becoming instruments of fate. Michelle's lawyer moved with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd performed such cuttings before. There was no melodrama, no last-minute tearful speech. The motions slid through like knives through paper. Cristian stood to speak because on some level he wanted to be seen as more than a victim. "I want to contest," he started, and then faltered. The lawyer for Michelle leaned forward and used a kind, efficient voice to explain the mechanics of a claim. "Mr. Alvarez," she said, using his last name like a proper grave marker, "you are welcome to litigate, but the costs will be yours if you proceed." Her pen moved. This was the moment where law and money partnered to make decisions feel inevitable. Outside, the city smelled of diesel and hot tar and a small bakery's sugar. He thought about the ticket and the way Sarah had held it up for a breath. He thought about the crate room where his hands had not yet adapted. He thought about the way humiliation had stripped him of private dignity into public parlance. Somewhere inside him, the kind of man who had once loved a small life with small certainties was dying, and a new man was being formed, gritty, cautious, not yet whole. "If this twist feels like a punch to the stomach, stay with the story," said the shelter volunteer later, as if narrating were part of the public service. The words were simple and sincere. They were the one small, unobtrusive ask that felt right in that moment, because in a life made of rubble, being witnessed mattered. If this line were in a video, it would be the gentle invitation to keep walking with Cristian through the dirt, the soft click of a hand extended. But he was not thinking about viewers. He was thinking about whose hands would be in his future. After the hearing, when the city light had gone soft and the custodial staff clicked off the fluorescents, Sarah found him on a bench outside the municipal building. He slept badly that night, thinking of the ticket, of lawyers, of the small economy of his life reduced to numbers. She sat beside him, a quiet presence with a thermos that held something warm. "You don't have to fight like a gladiator," she said, not as a dismissal, but as a suggestion that might be an alternative. "There's other ways to make a life. Honest work. People who see each other." "I don't know how to be a person without what I had," he admitted. Saying it out loud felt like catching breath. She looked at him as if he had said something true, but incomplete. "Being a person isn't what you had," she said. "It's who you are, after what you lose." It was a small sermon with no church behind it. It was also something like love. When the rain came that night, it was feathery, the kind that soaks through sleeves and calls for shelter. Cristian offered his jacket to a man with a damp hat and watched him pull it on without question. He had $3 and change in his pocket, and a heart that felt overfull with regret and possibility. Sarah left before the downpour got loud. She moved like someone practiced in the city's moods, disappearing into the alleys as if they were hallways of a familiar house. Over the next weeks, his life became a pattern of small recoveries and persistent setbacks. He kept a file folder where he stored eviction documents, bank letters, and pieces of the domestic collapse. He carried the ticket folded like a relic none of his advisors would recommend. He stacked crates. He repaired a neighbor's fence for pocket money. He attended a free legal clinic run by an overworked public defender who offered blunt hope. "Right now we're limited, but records are important. Keep everything." Gina started calling again, and this time she offered a solution that smelled like the same economic canniness he'd seen before. "We don't have to be enemies, Cristian," she said with those teeth behind plastic words. "You could sign over rights, get a lump sum, start fresh. But Susan from the shelter had taught him a phrase he spoke quietly to himself at night: honest work. He turned Gina down. It wasn't a moral victory. It was stoic practicality wrapped in shame. He could not stomach another transaction that would leave him smaller. Sarah's backstory threaded through the narrative in small vignettes that were not pity and not explanation so much as context. She had grown up in the city's outskirts, a child of a system that offered few ladders and many windows to be looked through. Her mother had worked double shifts, her father had left. She had fallen into life on the margins when a rent hike and a broken-down car chain reacted into eviction. In the shelter she had discovered a code: people pay what they can in kindness or skills. She'd learned to fix a broken zipper and to barter soup for a warm place to read. Her agency was not born of saintliness. The things she did had costs, and she had made choices that were sometimes ruthless in their practicality. That made her act with Cristian neither magical nor condescending. She had reasons to resist romanticizing him. She had reasons not to step into his life as a rescuer. But she also had a capacity to give, and when she gave, it was exact and precise. There were worse moments, nights when Cristian almost picked up the phone and called Henry and tore the years open, when he considered stealing Michelle's mailbox contents like a character in a cheap revenge plot. Each time he wanted to dissolve into rage, he remembered the dumpster and the warmth of Sarah's hand on the ticket. Each time he imagined what taking revenge would do to him. It would make him mirror what had destroyed him. He wanted to be someone different. One afternoon, the ticket made him bloodless with anxiety. He had learned that someone could claim lottery winnings only with more than a set of numbers. They needed the physical proof at the right registry, and he had no money to fight a legal claim. A rumor reached him that Michelle's lawyer had filed a motion to claim the lottery as marital property should the ticket be cashed by either party. That would mean the numbers were not merely ink on paper, but contested territory. Gina's face slid across his memory like a smear. Henry might sign affidavits. Paper and law could make you small in the same way as water entering a cavity. Cristian tracked the ticket's path with a franticness that felt like superstition. He imagined lottery offices. He imagined counters, clerks who look at you and say, "We need ID." He arranged to visit the municipal registry to see about claiming procedures. The clerk there suggested that to have standing, he would need to file an affidavit and provide proof of ownership. He had neither money nor proof beyond a faded piece of paper. That piece of paper had become a test of who he was. It was both a temptation and a tether. It was in that pressure that Gina re-emerged with a new idea that smelled of compromise and ease. "Let me handle it," she offered. "I'll work the forms. You pay me a fraction. You get your share." He looked at her and felt himself split into 100 small men who would have said yes. He wanted to be practical. He wanted the brute force of an infusion that could fix the bank account and give him back tools to fight legally. But he found this time a strange reserve. He thought of Sarah's principled refusal to profit by rescuing him at someone else's cost. He thought of how much of his life had been orchestrated by people who swapped ethics for neat ledgers. "How would I know you wouldn't just take it?" he asked Gina, feeling childish and perhaps wise. She laughed a laugh that had the edge of business in it. "Because I have a reputation. Because I've never needed to steal from a man who has nothing." Her words were a net of patronizing assumption and pointed truth. He felt anger rise and then drain into a more careful clarity. He realized the only person offering him a different kind of economy, one measured in work and dignity, was someone he could have dismissed as other. So he refused Gina's deal. It was not noble. It was a small, stubborn act of choosing what might keep him human, even if it meant longer winters. In the middle of this, a small victory arrived. The non-profit where he stacked crates found a permanent position open for someone reliable. The supervisor, an austere woman with a half-smile, offered him a part-time contract. "Place us in the morning, and we'll see about more." Cristian cried silently in the restroom before the shop opened because it felt like a credential he hadn't known he needed. He stood there counting bills in a pocket that had been empty for so long it had become a memory. These were the elements that made his days solid. A kettle that sometimes boiled on time, a person who smiled and said, "Nice to see you," the way Sarah would appear with a sandwich and then sit on the steps without asking for money. Love, if it would be called that later, arrived like duty, like the steady movement of small hands. Yet the machines of law and money kept clattering. Michel filed a motion that required him to appear in mediation. The subpoena arrived like a formal insult. He went because he had to, because the alternative was to have decisions made in rooms where his absence would be taken as consent. The mediation room was a drag bench of truth. Michelle sat in a green dress that made her look like she wore her freedom well. Her lawyer presented documents with an easy certainty. She spoke of practicality, of moving on, words that had been rearranged into a life plan. "You can sign the papers now," she said, the room's air conditioning tasting of a wedding she had never attended. "We can divide things fairly." He looked at her and could not find a thing to call her by that once familiar name. She had acquired a sterile calm that made the betrayal look like a tidy surgical procedure. "I don't want anything to do with her," he wanted to say. Instead, he signed a small initial on a dotted line suggested by his own counsel, a purely practical move, and left with nothing but a folder and more paperwork. Outside the mediation center, Sarah waited like a small island. She offered him a cigarette he did not want, a hand that steadied him when his legs failed. "You gave yourself away earlier," she said mildly. "Don't do it again." He considered that admonition. Later, as the lights sank and the city hummed like something alive and private, he thought about decisions, how each one was a small hinge that opened into different rooms of life. He thought about what it might mean to be rebuilt, not from money, but from the slow architecture of humility, work, and people. At home, if he still had a claim to that word, he placed the ticket on the kitchen table and watched it as if it were a small animal. He thought of casting it into the fireplace, of putting it in an envelope and mailing it to no one. He felt both a desire to see it realized and a shame at the way desire had so easily coexisted with his absence. That night, a figure tapped on his window. It was Sarah, a silhouette moved by the night. She pressed a paper cup with coffee into his hand and smiled in a way that invited nothing and promised something. "You look like you need sleep," she said. "You need to not be alone when your chest is loud." He did sleep for the first time in weeks, with a peace that did not erase the next day's problems, but made them bearable. The ticket lay folded in his pocket, like a present wrapped with threats and possibility. The arc of his fall had shifted into another arc, one of labor, slow reconciliations, and the painful courage to refuse easy bargains. The homeless woman had not made the decision for him, nor had she performed any miraculous unraveling of his life. Sarah's act, returning the ticket, refusing to convert his misfortune into her profit, was not a one-off. It was a moral architecture that kept presenting itself. Small acts of decency, invitations to honest work, the stubborn refusal to let his humiliation be exploited. Those acts insisted he could be rebuilt differently if he chose a path that kept his humanity intact. And yet, the structural forces of law, greed, and opportunism kept grinding toward him. Michelle's move to assert rights, Gina's coiled suggestions, the bank's procedural indifference, all of these would demand a reckoning that money alone could not buy. The lottery ticket, paradoxically, remained both temptation and tether, a bright scrap that could free him or bind him to a different kind of ruin if he took the wrong path. One morning, as autumn started to steal the color out of the city, Cristian found himself at a crossroads he had not expected. Gina appeared at the grocer where he worked one afternoon with an expression that had the curated softness of confidence. She slid a manila envelope across the counter with the casualness of someone who has planned other people's fall. "This will make things easier," she said, voice silk over steel. "You don't have to fight her in court if you take what's in here." He opened the envelope in the back storeroom when the supervisor was busy. Inside were documents, papers that appeared to be an offer. The numbers were enough to solve the near-term panic, a lump sum that could buy time, pay the back rent, perhaps even fund legal counsel enough to fight fairly. It was not a clean solution, it never is, but it was an option, and options are intoxicating when hunger sits at the table. He thought of Sarah and the way she had given back the ticket even though she could have used it. He thought about the dumpster, about the smell of rot, about the city nights when he had been too tired to stay awake. He thought about the way dignity had eroded like chalk. He folded the offer into his wallet and left it there with the ticket. The two papers nested together like a choice and a consequence, a map of potential and peril. He had to decide whether to accept a system's bribe and fix his life by the currency that had failed him, or to accept a slower, humbler life with the small chance that dignity might be reclaimed. As he stood in the cool air that evening, the city lights a soft blur, he felt the gravity of the decision. It was the kind of moment that could make a movie, one of those scenes where a man has to decide between the neatness of money and the mess of integrity. He wanted both, like most people. Sarah found him again because she had the habit of finding people in need. She did not need to find him. She lived in the gravitational field of such encounters. She touched his arm gently and looked at him the way someone looks at another who is wrestling with a heavy thing. He showed her the envelope without words. She read. Her face held a neutral calm, neither judgment nor praise. "You can take it," she said. "You can take it and be comfortable for a while. Or you can use it and end up like someone who has always done the math first and the love later. Either way, you'll be you." Her bluntness was both relief and torch. It didn't solve anything. It forced him to be honest with himself. He thought then of the title the world might give his story. His wife's betrayal destroyed him, but a homeless woman transformed his life forever, and he wanted to hate the neat headline while also recognizing something true. His life had been fractured by betrayal, and his path away from ruin would not be a single event, but the accumulation of small, decisive acts from unexpected places. That title would be true only if he allowed the transformation to be more than an external fix. Sarah's role would not be to fix. It would be to set the conditions under which he might choose differently. He folded the envelope back and left it on the counter. He walked outside into the thinning city air and, for the first time in months, felt the brittle stirrings of something like hope. It was not the reckless kind that comes with a lottery win. It was the kind that arrives when steady, honest hands begin to build again. A few blocks away, under a swarm of pigeons and the hum of neon, a man approached with the certainty of someone who had decided to trade his old life for a new model. Cristian's hands were empty. His pockets had a tangle of paper and the faint scent of fryer oil. He had nothing to prove and everything to rebuild. The transformation had not happened yet. It would take time, cuts, compromises, nights of bone-deep fatigue. But a pivot had been made, imperfect and fragile. Sarah had not swooped in with a miracle. She had simply returned what was not hers, offered what she had without charity's hauteur, and kept her own dignity intact. That was the seed. What would bloom was still undecided. When he turned the corner, there was someone waiting on the stoop of a community center, an acquaintance from the job site offering a part-time position building wooden crates for local markets. "We could use another pair of hands," he said. The man's voice was plain and without fanfare. The offer was modest, regular hours, no glamour, the chance to be paid at the end of the week. Cristian answered with a small nod. He took the job because he had learned to choose the scaffoldings that would not collapse when the wind came. He would earn slowly. He would pay back the debts as he could. He would try, at last, to make his life fit his hands. When he called Michelle to tell her that he had accepted an arrangement and would not contest a certain item at mediation, her voice did not waver. "Do what's best for you," she said. "I'm doing the same." He hung up and looked at the ticket again. The numbers seemed less like a destination now than a set of coordinates, points on a map he might visit, but would not let redraw his soul. He felt a small gratitude toward the homeless woman who had returned it. Her act had not changed his bank balance, but it had shifted the weight of his choices. On his first day at the crate shop, Sarah appeared with a thermos and a grin like a lighthouse. "I told you honest work," she said simply. He laughed, the sound dry, and began to stack wood, feeling his muscles remember the geometry of useful labor. What comes next would be harder than any imagined lottery windfall, and the tests would multiply. Gina would not vanish, Henry's role would need confronting, and the legal system would continue to spin. But the shape of the path had changed. He had a job, a folder with documents, a woman who had refused to use his downfall for her rise, and a sliver of something that might, in time, become steadier than money. Night fell. The city hummed with ordinary life. Buses hissed. A violinist played on the corner. Somewhere a child laughed. Cristian's world had been destroyed and was in the slow business of being remade. He had been betrayed, and the fallout had been catastrophic. But an unlikely hand had intervened in the smallest, most decisive way. He had choices again, flawed and heavy, and for the first time in months those choices felt like a kind of freedom. Outside, in a place where discarded things attained new meaning, a piece of paper waited in a pocket. The ticket remained like a promise whose terms he had not yet read. He kept it close, not as a key to fortune, but as a reminder that sometimes the most transformative acts are not the ones that hand you everything. They are the ones that hand you back what you were about to lose. The crate shop smelled of pine and varnish, and the particular ache of work done with hands. Morning light cut through the high windows in thin bars that painted the benches. Dust motes spun like tiny, slow planets. Cristian set each board into place with the concentration of someone practicing a new language. His palms were calloused in patterns that felt like progress. The legal calendar, however, continued to orbit him. Michelle's lawyer had not relented. A motion remained on file to declare any lottery winnings marital property, and Gina's presence hovered like a second storm front. Offers that suggested expedience, threats that implied patience. On top of that, small bureaucratic things kept arriving: a subpoena for a mediation session, a second letter demanding bank statements, an invoice from a tow company for a car he no longer had. The machinery of consequence is not theatrical. It is patient and administrative, and it grinds in the quiet hours. When the mediation day came, the municipal meeting room felt punishing in its neutrality. A long table, a clock that refused to be friendly, the dulling hum of fluorescent lights, everything designed to make private pain legal and polite. Michelle arrived in a blazer whose seams were sharpened by an intention to perform composure. Gina was not present, but her fingerprints were, in suggestions whispered on the phone, in the thin legalese of an envelope that had crossed Cristian's palms weeks earlier. Cristian had no lawyer to match Michelle's team. The public defender he had briefly consulted carried a schedule like an atlas of exhausted hopes. He had, instead, a thin folder of documents gathered by him and by the shelter volunteer who had become something like an unofficial ally. On the top of the stack was the ticket, folded in the way he now always folded it. Not a talisman, but an artifact. Beneath it lay a notarized affidavit Sarah had written, clear and unsentimental. She had found the ticket in the dumpster behind the bakery. She had returned it. She had witnessed the way it had been folded in his pocket. Her statement was not theatrical. It was precise. When the mediator asked for opening remarks, Michelle's lawyer moved with the ease of practice. "This is a matter of marital property," she said. The phrase landed with the finality of a seal. If proceeds from the lottery are realized, they would be subject to division. Cristian rose and felt his knees hesitate, as if the floor might tilt. He could make an accusation. He could stand and recite every injustice he had been given, and every corner of the life that had been pulled away. He thought of Gina's folded envelope, the promise of ease, the smell of sin disguised as common sense. He thought of Sarah, and of the way she had returned the ticket without sermon. He thought, too, of what playing the game would ask of him. Complicity in maneuvers that profited from transactions he would later regret. I don't want to use this to hurt anyone," he said finally, voice sanded by months of disappointment. The phrase surprised the room with its weirdness. People expect raw anger at such hearings, the theatrics that make for good narrative. Instead, he offered a strange, quiet refusal. "If there's money, I don't want it to be the thing that destroys more people." Michelle's eyes narrowed. "This is about fairness," she said sharply. "We built a life together." "Maybe," he answered, "but not by erasing people." The mediator sighed like someone who had seen versions of this before. "We can place a temporary hold on any claim while we explore settlement." The legal path lengthened into a negotiation. Behind the polite phrases and the sterile coffee cups, there were numbers and positions and back-channel maneuvers. Gina's intermediary called him with a new offer and a new impatience. Henry texted, then did not call. The shelter volunteer produced a contact at a community legal clinic who would take a look at his papers pro bono. Sarah sat through some of the meetings in the cheap chairs near the back, thermos steady on her lap, a presence that was both unremarkable and anchoring. It was in one of those back and forths that Gina tested the limits of patience. "You can accept what's being offered," she said on a sunless afternoon in a diner that pretended it wasn't part of the city's net of liabilities. "You'll get ahead, or you can keep fighting and maybe get nothing." Cristian listened, folded his hands around a coffee that had long since lost the ability to provide warmth. "And what about Michelle's transfers?" he asked. "There were funds moved without my consent. Where is that accounted for?" Gina's mouth tightened. "That's complicated. Keep your eye on what's possible, not on imagined slights." "All slights are imagined until they're documented," Cristian said, "or until someone takes responsibility." She left, her carriage the same as always, calculated, practiced. The diner emptied around him. He wanted to be angry, wanted to chase something that might look like justice. Instead, he found that the moral compass inside him had been rewired by months of moving through small, corrective acts, stacking crates, answering texts honestly, showing up for shifts he could not afford to miss. The engine that had formerly been accelerated by pride was now lubricated by something smaller, predictability and integrity. There was a hearing at the county clerk's office regarding chain of custody and claim priority. Michelle's counsel argued that the ticket had been part of marital assets because it had been purchased with joint funds. Cristian's defense had little more than his word and the ticket itself. Then the shelter volunteer presented a late addition, a ledger of electronic transfers that suggested some funds had been moved into Michelle's separate accounts in the months before she left, a pattern not incontrovertible but suggestive. It was not explosive evidence, it was a strand. In court, strings are rarely enough to tear down a fabric, but sometimes enough strands make a fray. Sarah's affidavit carried weight in a way the room did not anticipate. It tied the ticket to a specific moment outside the registry's purview. It placed ownership in Cristian's hands at the time the paper was found and returned. Ownership of a physical ticket counts for something in the legal world, and a credible witness can tip scales that look unmoved by sentiment. When Sarah, called to the stand, sat with an unassuming clarity, people in the room noticed how ordinary and truthful she looked. Her hands were clean, She did not speak with florid rhetoric. She was asked when and where she had found the ticket and answered plainly, behind the bakery, in the dumpster, on an afternoon when she had been fishing for a stray chip tray. She described the motion of returning the paper and the gesture with which Cristian had accepted it. Michelle's counsel tried to needle at the memory. Was she certain? Had she been paid? But Sarah's economy of detail, her lack of need for drama, made her answers solid. The judge, a man who had seen many disputes born of greed, looked at Sarah and at Cristian's thin folder, and then at Michelle. He did not hand down a sweeping moral victory. He did not make a poem of their grief. He made a pragmatic ruling. The court would not preemptively award any potential winnings. The ticket would remain physically with Cristian under a court order to secure it while claims were adjudicated. Any future claim would require more detailed proof. For Cristian, this was not victory. It was a pause, a bureaucratic breathing space. He walked out of the courtroom with a small legal restraint. He could not cash the ticket nor use it to leverage loans. It was, temporarily, a prescribed object, but it was, in its own small way, his. That had weight. Michelle's face hardened in a way that confirmed for him the truth of their split. She sought tidy outcomes. She sought to remove emotional complexity from the ledger of her life. Gina's messages became terse menaces. Henry texted, ambivalent, an apology without grip. But the immediate thundercloud had passed without lightning. The weeks after the hearing settled into a rhythm of slow work and slow rebuilding. The crate shop grew busier through holiday contracts. Cristian moved from part-time to a modest full-time role. He learned to sand edges until they were gentle, to measure twice and cut once. He began to teach a younger man how to knot a joint. It surprised him how little of leadership required an audience. Mostly it required showing up. Small things started to happen to him. A friend from once distant days brought a donated lamp because he had heard Cristian worked nights. Mrs. Alvarez from down the hall brought an extra loaf of bread. A neighbor helped him carry a piece of furniture for extra cash. These were not grand gestures. They were human economies that paid out in dignity. Gina, unhappy that the court had not turned into an arena for her sort of expedience, tried another lever. She suggested privately that Cristian sign papers that would release her to help him manage any proceeds later, a verbal contract thinly veiled as protection. He thought about taking the envelope again, about fixing his account, about paying down the most threatening debt. His fingers closed around the idea and then uncurled. "I don't want to be someone who sells himself for a loan," he told her when she pressed. "What you want to do is make things neat for you." She smiled like a person who has practiced compromise long enough to forget it is sometimes theft. "You can be sensible. Being sensible doesn't require dishonesty," he said. The sentence felt like the skeleton of a new creed inside him. He walked away from the diner's table more resolved than proud. The transformation was not a single incandescent thing. It came in the slow accumulation of days, aligned to small ethics, returning borrowed tools, apologizing when he snapped at a co-worker, paying back a neighbor a sum he had once promised to return, and did. It came in the embarrassment of standing in open air and speaking plainly to people who had once been allies and then detached themselves. It came in the steady presence of Sarah, who kept giving the same small kindnesses without counting them. There were moments of temptation. Gina's intermediary appeared one afternoon with a cash-filled envelope and a diagram of a simple path out of current worries. The envelope was heavy with possibility. For a moment the old hunger returned. A single transaction could buy him time, could reconstitute him as someone with the currency to fight back. He imagined calling a lawyer, hiring experts, turning the legal machine into the very tool that had once ground him down for good. For a heartbeat, he considered it. Then he stepped outside and saw Sarah across the lot, leaning on a lamppost, feeding a pigeon with scraps. She looked up and met his eye with that same unshakable calm. He remembered her hand returning the ticket without calculation. He remembered her refusal to be a profiteer from another's wreckage. He folded the envelope closed. He put it in his jacket pocket for a day, so that he could feel its weight, and then left it in a book at the shelter with a note that he wanted it returned to the donor. He never opened it. Meanwhile, Michelle's campaign to tie up his life in legal threads continued in another direction. She filed a motion to collect on some assets that had been quickly transferred in the weeks before she left. The accounting looked clean on paper, but had undercurrents. Automated transfers, coded descriptions, the sort of administrative maneuvering that functions like a surgeon's cut, precise and often painless to those who profit from it. A forensic accountant was involved at one point. The process of having money traced and categorized felt like watching a mystery novel where the solution is a spreadsheet. During this period, Henry came by once, a half-formed apology in hand. He stood near the threshold of the shop and watched Cristian sand a joint. "I didn't mean," he began, then stopped. His face was a map of some shame that had been added to his life, and it looked like a small thing in the cold noon light. Cristian set down the plane he was using and looked at him. There was no melodramatic cruelty in his gaze now, only a careful weariness. "You made choices," he said. "So did I. We all live with ours." Henry tried to reach out, then seemed to withdraw. "I can help," he offered then, with the neatness of someone who wanted to do a single good thing to repay a debt. Cristian accepted a small help. Henry agreed to supply materials at cost occasionally, a way of quietly acknowledging responsibility without a public scandal. It was not enough to erase what had happened, but it was an amendment, small, practical, that made living possible. In time, Henry's presence was frayed rather than erased. A tempered, useful connection rather than the sharp intimacy that had once destroyed Cristian. There was a day, months after the ticket had been found and returned, when Gina's strategies began to look brittle in public. A social acquaintance, annoyed by the way she treated people, spoke in a quiet, public setting about the patterns of behavior that used to be gossip and not evidence. Small things aggregate. A bank refused a flagged transaction. A lawyer, motivated by something like civic pride, made a procedural challenge that embarrassed Gina's intermediary. The details of greed are always ordinary. Their exposure rarely resembles a revelation, and more like a slow, mundane unspooling. During these moments, Sarah remained a constant. She did not demand the spotlight, nor did she accept the role of martyr. She accepted, however, a different kind of elevation in Cristian's life, that of partner in the honest economies they both believed in. She began to take shifts at the community center during the afternoons, when her schedule allowed, and Cristian, when he could, taught basic woodworking to teens who had never held a plane. Their partnership formed in the space between two people who had been damaged by systems and who chose to rebuild by refusing the same violences in return. The climate of their lives matured into small, durable architectures. They shared a second-hand radio that barely held station. They took turns keeping a kettle on. They developed rituals for bad days and comical celebrations for small victories, repairing a fence, arranging a delivery on time, paying a bill. Sarah's backstory, the outline of eviction, of a childhood of being moved like a piece in someone else's game, remained part of her, but it was neither the only thing nor a story to be used. It was a set of reasons that both explained and refused to excuse the hardness she had developed. The ticket, once a glittering potentiality, now curiously resembled a public object. There were moments when he would lay it on the table and watch Sarah pour coffee without looking at him, and he would feel a strange peace. He had chosen not to weaponize fortune. He had not cashed it, because he had learned that the structure of his life must stand on bones he could look at and own. In the late winter, a settlement was proposed that was not cinematic but practical. Neither side would enter into a drawn-out litigation over the ticket, and certain transferred funds would be reviewed and partially returned to Cristian's account. It was a compromise with teeth, a legal settlement that paid him enough to clear immediate threats, past due notices, a small emergency fund, and a modest payment that allowed him to secure a cheap apartment rather than remain at odd places. It was not a fortune. It was, however, a platform. When the settlement was finalized, Cristian did something that surprised no one and surprised some. He took a portion of the settlement and quietly donated it to the community grocer where he had stacked crates, earmarked for emergency food vouchers. He used another portion to secure the apartment, to pay a deposit, and to buy a workbench for the back room where he could teach others. The ledger of his life had shifted from a model that measured value by a bank account to one that measured value by the degree of repair he could do in the lives around him. Michelle moved out of the picture in a different way. She kept pieces that were hers by law and let others go. In interviews with mutual acquaintances, she presented a version of life that was tidy and forward-looking. For Cristian, her withdrawal was sad, but not cataclysmic. The couple's final legal disentanglement was more administrative than dramatic. He had, by then, discovered an appetite for life that did not require proving to her that he was whole. Where the title of his story would later find its headline, "His wife's betrayal destroyed him, but a homeless woman transformed his life forever," there were dozens of unglamorous scenes that explained the truth. Sarah's transformation of his life was not a single salvific gesture. It was a pedagogical series. She returned the ticket. She refused to be a profiteer. She proposed honest work. She lent practical directions. She gave a kind of moral clarity that he could live by in the small choices. One spring evening, months into the new rhythm, Cristian and Sarah sat on the small stoop outside their modest apartment. A neighbor's radio played low. The city smelled like rain coming. He had a splinter caught in his finger from the day's work, and she had a mapping of faded calluses where her hands had become instruments of care. They had, between them, constructed a life that required mutual giving and the humble accounting of debts and payments. "Do you ever regret not trying harder to get it back?" Sarah asked then, not accusatory but curious. She had a way of asking that made honesty safe. Cristian watched a pigeon hop on the curb. "Sometimes," he said. "At first, I thought winning would fix everything, but it would have only replaced one hollow with another." "Money changes things," Sarah said. "Not always what you'd expect." "Yeah," he answered. "It buys you choices, but it won't teach you how to be human." They laughed then, a small, dry sound like someone learning a new gait. She rested her head for a moment against his shoulder and then sat up, attention already on tomorrow's tasks. Each of them had scars, hers from nights under awnings that built a muscle of endurance, his from the months of humiliation that sharpened humility. Their lives were not perfect. They were, instead, plausible. In the months and then years that followed, the partnerships they built spread out like tidy grafts. Cristian's crate workshop became a tiny local institution, a place where teenagers learned a trade, where people with unstable histories found a measure of steadiness, where aesthetic work met functional necessity. He taught with a blunt patience. He taught how to measure and plan and correct errors without shame. There were parents who asked him for help and teenagers who came back years later with small jobs they owed him. Sarah worked at the community center in the afternoons and, when she was ready, took on a part-time position at a thrift shop run by a non-profit. She was paid, slowly and painfully, and she accepted the humiliation of interviews with the same practical dignity she had shown since the dumpster. Henry, when he visited, was quieter than before. He had his own life to restore, and when he did so, he did not seek to be a protagonist in Cristian's story. Gina moved onward in her practiced way, but her influence in that neighborhood had dulled. Social economies have long memories. Cristian's identity adjusted from someone defined by the marriage he had lost to someone defined by the things he now made and the people he now worked alongside. The sense of being seen returned, not in the way he had once craved, but in the quieter way of being recognized as a useful person. That recognition built into a sturdiness that outlasted the occasional night of doubt. Years later, standing with a student beside a bench of newly built crates, Cristian thought of the dumpster and the way a single human act, someone returning a ticket, had redirected the scale of his life. He understood finally that transformation is less about one dramatic reversal and more about the cumulative architecture of small moral acts. Sarah had offered him a code, and he had lived into it. Their relationship by then had the contours of something steady. It had tenderness, it had friction. It was not the kind of quick-fix romance that makes glossy endings. It was mutual respect threaded with affection. They lived in a small apartment with a kitchen that smelled occasionally like burnt coffee and the wood shavings of a piece in progress. They had a ritual of making a simple meal on Friday nights and listening to the static of an old radio. They lent money to friends and asked nothing in return. They argued about small things, about whether to keep a splintered table or to throw it away, and then fix the table together. When someone asked him, years after the dumpster, whether he would have taken Gina's envelope if fate had offered it sooner, Cristian would answer that he did not know. He had been destroyed, in a way, by betrayal. He had been reborn, if rebirth is the right word, through a discipline of repair. The homeless woman had not rescued him through miracle. She had returned what he had lost and insisted that he not turn moral ruin into someone else's gain. That insistence had been the hinge. There is a kind of justice there that does not look like spectacle. It looks like a man teaching someone else to plane wood without splintering their hope. It looks like a woman who once lived on the margins now managing a budget and lending, modestly, to a friend in need. It looks like two people who had once been looked through by the world, becoming people who look at others and see them. The ticket remained in a small drawer labeled Papers, a label that read like a domestic consolation. Sometimes on rainy evenings, Cristian would open the drawer and smooth the paper between his fingers. The numbers were faded, the ink from years of being touched. It had been, he knew, a door he had never fully walked through, but it had also been a test of the kind of man he would become. The quiet truth was this: the lottery ticket could have been a quick reconstitution of his losses, but it could not have repaired everything that had broken inside him. Sarah's gift, paradoxically small and enormous at once, returning the ticket and insisting on decency, had given him the room to make choices that stitched him back together. She had not been a savior in the gospel sense. She had been the ethics he needed to practice. When the neighborhood held a small fair to celebrate the community center's 10th year, Cristian and Sarah walked through the stalls. Teenagers he had taught displayed shelves they had built. A mural painted by a local artist included a small, unacknowledged corner, where a figure returned a scrap of paper to another, an image that flattered them both. People who had once seen them as the dispossessed now nodded. The difference was not in the nod. The difference was that they were the kind of people who would nod back and help someone up. That night on the stoop, Sarah laughed at some story a friend told. Cristian felt the laugh like warmth. He thought about the days when humiliation had been a public performance and recognized how far from that place he now stood. He also recognized that nothing about his life was perfect. There were nights when the bills stacked up and when the tax papers were confusing and when the temptation to slide back into easier compromises was sharp. But those nights now were part of a life that had mechanisms for repair. Mutual trust, a community that answered when called, the simple dignity of honest labor. At the edge of the small stoop garden, a discarded lottery flyer stuck to the pavement like confetti. Cristian picked it up, smoothed it, and dropped it into a nearby recycling bin. It felt like an act of finality that was also soft and free of accusation. If there was an image that told the whole story, it was not a chest full of money or a dramatic court verdict. It was the thermos Sarah kept by the workshop door, steaming on a cold morning, and the two of them sharing it in a brief, unremarked ritual that said, "We are still here, and we are still choosing." If this story moved you, and you want to follow other tales of quiet redemption and human resilience, subscribe for more. And consider sharing it with someone who needs to know that small mercies can rebuild a life.